What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to another episode of America Trends, podcast.com. Larry Rifkin, along with John Krofsick. And, John, thanks for always being along for the ride. Couldn't do it without you.
We're having a good time.
We are.
It's a fun ride.
But we're also talking about a lot of things that are really, really serious. And sometimes we can be very jocular. I don't know on this particular open whether we should not just get straight to the point.
I think we should. This is a very serious topic, a very big problem.
But I've got to tell you, the gentleman that we have that we're bringing to you in just a moment, Dr. Jon Zibbell, is remarkable. I mean, he really is. He has seen his way around this opioid crisis in just about every manner you can imagine.
Well, we need all the information we need to get to the bottom of this opioid problem and solve it. I mean, it's killing people. It really is.
Well, it's killing people at a rate that is astonishing here in the United States. And I know you've heard a lot about it. So I'm not going to kid you. You're reading about it all the time. And you might say, well, why Larry? Why John? Why do I need to hear a podcast about it? Honest to goodness, Dr. Zibbell is going to bring you a perspective on this issue that I don't think you have ever heard. First of all, he is an anthropologist of medical information. So he's somebody who really excavates this stuff from a whole different angle. And that's one of the things that I think we pride ourselves on, John, is to bring you interesting topics that are relevant to where America is headed. But we try to do it with a little bit more depth and clarity and bring you people like Dr. Zibbell.
Well, I tell you, every podcast I learned something new. So for me, it's been a great education.
Well, there's going to be a quiz really, really soon that we're going to do on air. John said he's learned a lot of things.
I have.
So, folks, should I give him a true and false, or should I give him a multiple choice, or should I force him to do an essay? I'd love to see, and I don't want it not handwritten. No, I'll never be able to score that.
You can't get my hieroglyphics.
No, I'll have to go to a cave and read that. It'll be more perceptible. But I've got to tell you that seriously, I was looking for a long time for someone to talk about this issue. And we found Dr. Zibbell through RTI International, and they do a host of things in terms of education about medical issues. But they said to us, he's great. He's fantastic. And he really was. And the way that he talks about this crisis, it's a multiple set of crises that we have as it relates to opioids.
Yeah, well, I mean, I still believe it's the pharmaceutical companies are really to blame. I mean, you look at the TV, all the happy pills they're trying to sell us, and every night. I mean, so everybody wants to be happy, right?
Well, it's not only that, John. I mean, we are the most over-prescribed, over-medicated society in the history of man and womankind. I mean, there's no question about it. Everybody's on something to bring them up, to bring them down, to give them a little relief, less anxiety, less stress, no pain, whatever it may be. Doctors are handing these things out like they're placebos.
Well, plus they're up in Washington. They got some of the biggest. What do they call them?
Lobbyists.
That's the word. The pharmaceutical companies.
Oh, they've got about 10 to every congressman. So, I mean, it is, you're right. The money that's going into this is just maddening and disgusting. I mean, I've got to say that.
And I believe that they knew these opioids were as addictive as they were. And doctors were really sold the bill of goods about pain and about what these can do for people. They wanted repeat customers. I mean, basically, they wanted, and they got their repeat customers.
And I'll take a little bit of responsibility. I mean, a small piece, because many years ago, back in the 1990s, when I was in public television, we were involved in a special with a doctor. I'm not going to mention his name because he's among so many who at that time said, aha, this is what patients want. They want a pain-free experience. And so we did a special with him that went across the country. Very prominent guy from New York City. And again, it was all about pain management. And at the time, they thought that these opioids were really the miracle drug that was going to answer all the questions that we've had over history. How do we keep us pain-free? And so I think a lot of people overestimated what this could do and underestimated the many consequences and side effects. I think there were good people at the beginning who went into this with the most noble of intentions, but then it got out of hand.
Oh, I think so. And I and the sad part is the money that's involved here that they're making, and I don't know if they still are, but I know the pharmaceutical industry was paying doctors, giving them trips and stuff. For using
and now
pill.
that collusion.
Yes. So there's a lot of stuff
No,
going
you're
on
right.
here that's
and I've
really
always
bad.
said that in America, nothing succeeds like excess. So if there's something good, we jump on it and we double down on it, and then it becomes excessive. And so if we have a way to preserve foods, or we have a way to give you some pleasure in one way or another, we'll figure out a way to make it really toxic at the end of the day.
We can't expect doctors to go in and tinker with our bodies and not have a little pain either. I think we carried the no pain
mantra.
Far.
Yeah,
Too
I
far.
agree with you. I do. I don't think, again, at the beginning that this was a bad idea,
Right.
and it certainly is a great goal. But at the end of the day, right now, we have two crises going on. We've got a legal crisis as it relates to pharmaceuticals, and there are many efforts that are being made, from suing pharmaceutical companies to making certain that unused pills are taken away, or that you are held responsible if you have kids in the household, that that those pills are your obligation, to limiting the amount that doctors can prescribe. But we've still got this issue, but we're beginning to get it a little bit more under control. But what it has morphed into is an illegal trade in heroin and fentanyl. So we've got both of these crises. And Dr. Zibbell, I think, John, really is remarkable in laying out the case as an anthropologist.
I agree.
For all of this.
Yeah.
So we're going to listen to him now. It's a serious issue. And by the way, we're also going to bonus this particular podcast with an interview that we did with Sam Quinones. And he's referred to by
yes.
Dr. Zibbell in
Yep.
this. The book is Dreamlands. And he talks about the crisis and the genesis of it, too. Two of the greatest thinkers in America on this topic, only on AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. With us today on America Trends Podcast is Dr. Jon Zibbell. And I've got to tell you, Dr. Zibbell, this issue of opioids has really caught the attention of the American public. For you, somebody who's been working in this field for a long time, has it taken us too long to recognize the seriousness of all this?
Yeah, I would say the most part it has. The prescription opioid epidemic, which really kicked off the opioid epidemic more generally, I think took a long time to get going. I know my colleagues at CDC started recognizing the mortality data around 2007 and 2008. And by this time, it was already 7-8 years into the epidemic. So I think, mortality data is often slow, and so the overdose data is what really was pinpointed first, and that takes a couple of years to gather and access and analyze. And so the system itself and the data we were using to identify it on a national level was a little protracted, and so it took a little bit of time to catch up. And so we really recognized it around 2007, 2008. Although now looking back retrospectively, we know it started in 1999, 2000.
And when we look at it, was it this movement toward better pain management where a lot of doctors and medical providers saying, we are not going to let people suffer? And so we had these new drugs at our disposal. Take it from there, the story.
Yeah, so, I think it was a confluence of events. I think some were genuine, some had profit motives, and some were historically forgetful and naive. I think first, in the 1990s, we started really recognizing chronic pain more, so much so that the medical community started referring it as the fifth vital sign. And we had a lot of chronic pain in the country. Prior to that, the opioids that were available were the small milligram opioids, the 5 milligram Percocets, the 5 milligram hydrocodone. And in 1996, when Purdue came out with OxyContin, which was an extended release, high milligram opioid, it really changed the game because it packed a lot of opioids in one pill. And that was designed originally for chronic pain. And so you had the medical community really kind of embracing this notion. They were experiencing people with a lot of chronic pain. They wanted to treat them. At the same time, I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine had a 300-word blurb that cited research, and I think the research was done in the early 80s, that took about 300 patients that were prescribed opioids in a medical setting, I think in a hospital, and it reported that out of those 300, only one person led to an opioid dependency from their time in the hospital. And their conclusion was from this that opioids, when prescribed correctly, did not lead to dependency. And this really was a historical forgetter, because our experiences at the end of the 19th century and then in the 20s and the 30s and the 60s and the 70s with opioids, we knew that they were highly addictive. But nevertheless, there was a kind of historical forgetfulness there. At the same time, Purdue, and we know this now from the historical record in court cases that have been litigated, that they had a real active involvement in advertising and marketing their drugs. They went to doctors, they gave incentives, they claimed they weren't addictive, they went to medical conferences. And so you had, pharmaceutical industries pushing the medications for the medical community. You have the medical community wanting, something to give their chronic pain patients beyond their patients, that have malignant pain, end-of-life pain. And then you had this kind of historical forgetfulness of the struggles we had since the end of the 19th century. And then those confluence of events kind of brought us to the point where we had kind of mass prescriptions of opioids for chronic pain. And I think, those three together brought us to the point, where we ended up in about 2006, 7, and 8.
A lot of people get very confused in this story, and you've done a great job there giving us the precedent for all of this as to where does the heroin and the fentanyl that we read about all the time in relation to the opioid crisis, where does that come in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the one thing about opioids that are different from all other drugs, save maybe benzodiazepines and alcohol, is, the more you take them, the more of a tolerance you get and the more you need to feel the same outcome and the same euphoria. So it almost has a built-in mechanism that the longer you take them, the higher and higher doses you have to get. And when you take them regularly over time, it creates a physical dependency. Not a psychological dependency like we can look at cannabis and cocaine, but a physical dependency where if you go through cessation, you go through physical withdrawal pains. And, William Burroughs called with opioid withdrawal the algebra of need, because it doesn't matter who takes them. If any human being takes them for, extended period of time, 2, 3, 4 weeks, they will go through withdrawal if they stop taking them. So, giving a lot of pain patients these medications, there was a percentage of all those people that developed opioid use disorders. There's been a lot of work at NIDA and Nora Volkol, the director of NIDA, doing some interesting brain research, kind of looking at, opioid use disorders similar to clinical depression, where it's related to kind of hormone, dopamine, serotonin in the body, where people can be born depleted or not having levels that make them feel comfortable. So when they take exogenous opioids, meaning opioids from outside the body, it triggers something in them where it makes them feel normal. They need to take more to feel normal. And so, there's a small percentage of people that are taking these pain medications that are going to develop opioid use disorders. So as we increase prescribing, we also increase the number of people that were sliding down the path of opioid dependency into addiction. Now, what happened was in 2007, 2008, and Sam Quinones does a great job of documenting this in Dreamland, another confluence of events where, Mexican drug trafficking organizations and kind of international drug trafficking organizations, the literature kind of bears this out, shows that they recognized that there was an increasing number of people that were opioid dependent, and an increasing number of people that either lost their health insurance or got kicked off their medication or were too, chaotic users to that their doctors recognized they had a problem and kicked them off. And now these people have physical addictions, opioid dependency that they can't get satisfied with prescription medication. And those people were really susceptible to heroin. I've met actually a few people in my own field research that have said that they had friends when they told them they no longer could get their medication or they got kicked off their medication or they lost their insurance, that the friends offered them heroin and said, heroin is just like the pills. It's cheaper. It's easier to get. And so you had an increase in heroin supply coming into the country, in the mid-2000s. Now, bear in mind, we've had heroin epidemics go up and down, but this last one, which really took off in about 2005, 6, and 7, coincided with the height of the prescription opioid epidemic. And the reason we know there's a connection between the two is CDC published a vital signs in 2013 where they showed that 4 out of 5 new heroin users started their first opioid with a prescription opioid. And so we know there was a connection between people using prescription opioids, whether they were prescribed to them or they got them as diverted illicit medications and then transition to heroin. And prescription opioids and heroin are pharmacologically similar. They both act on the mu receptor in the body. They both trigger the same neurochemical pathways and central nervous system interactions. And so it makes sense that someone with a physical addiction to, let's say, extended release oxycodone, i.e. OxyContin, when they no longer have any of those medications and they're sick, that the transition to heroin is, a rational, albeit dangerous decision, but a very much rational one.
When did public health professionals and the medical community really begin to wake up to this tie and the insidious effect that all of this was having?
Yeah, what's interesting, I think we saw this with HIV as well, and I would also say with hepatitis C, is that, states and jurisdictions were seeing this way before the federal government. And so, there was a lot of states, governors, community-based organizations were seeing this problem develop, increased drug use in their neighborhoods, in their communities, increased heroin in their communities. I think when the federal government and CDC recognized it was the amazing work of people like Chris Jones and Len Pelosi at CDC, who were really showing these data on a national level. And Chris published, I was the lead author in that Vital Signs in 2013, which showed the connection. And I think that connection, the relationship between what I would call iatrogenic addiction, meaning addiction generated by the medical community vis-a-vis prescription drugs, in the link to the illicitly made opioids, heroin and fentanyl, that link, I think, really woke up the federal government to take a more kind of active role in seeing the relationship between the two, that it just wasn't medical, that it was a totality of an epidemic.
It's so stunning when you hear about young people and many who are suburban or rural, and then you hear about people who are living lives that you would consider professional lives, and they get caught up in this, and you talk about the physical addiction. But heroin For those of us of a certain age, we think of heroin as the worst of the worst, and it used to be called horse, and who would ever take that?
No, that's right. And a lot of the moral panics around heroin, are accurate in the sense that, repetitive use leading to physical addiction makes you crave and do things because withdrawal is horrendous. What's interesting, though, is that, heroin, the bad name of heroin seemed, to develop outside of the prescription opioid realm. And so, as I said before, heroin and prescription opioids like hydrocodone, oxycodone, hydromorphone, oxymorphone, Opana, they're pharmacologically similar. And so, it's important for your listeners to know that, the moral panics around heroin, especially its kind of street use and its street markets and the crime and the prohibition around it, it definitely comes with more violence because of that prohibition, because of that illegality. However, the physical manifestations are the same. If someone is physiologically dependent on oxycodone for a chronic pain condition and they're getting high doses of opioids from their doctor, they have the same and similar manifestations as someone that's regularly using heroin. The difference is that the former person, the prescription user, has access to the supply, and so theoretically will not go through withdrawal because they have that supply, where the heroin user needs to get money in order to buy that from the street. And so it's really the kind of prohibition relationship to heroin that causes a lot of the harms we're seeing with that, which is why places like Canada and Switzerland are actually using heroin as an agonist to treat opioid addiction, similar to we use methadone and buprenorphine. So what I would say is, as an opioid is an opioid is an opioid. It's really just its availability and what people have to do to use it repetitively.
I'm reading where opioid painkillers are prescribed far less than they were several years ago, and yet at the same time, this crisis is not easing, and addiction seems to be surging. I know acknowledgement of this is certainly out there. We have a commission now that the president has established, but really, where are we in this fight?
Yeah, so, I also want, to explain this to your listeners because it's really important, this aspect. So we usually describe the opioid epidemic as a singular epidemic, right? The opioid epidemic. But when you look at the trends, and when I worked at CDC, we actually argued this with the data in some of our MMWRs. It's actually two distinct but interrelated epidemics. And what I mean is, on the one hand, you have a prescription opioid epidemic that really started both epidemics. Starting in 1999, all the conditions I mentioned, kind of, it goes up. As you mentioned, it peaked last year, this year, and it's starting to go down. It's starting to go down because, doctors are recognizing the dangers of it. CDC put their opioid guidelines, prescribing guidelines out. There's been a lot of doctor education, a lot of media reports, so doctors are prescribing less. We also know that the morbidity and mortality associated with that prescribing is also going down. However, at the same time, starting in about 2005, 6, and 7, overlapping trends, we see an increase in what I call the illicit side of the epidemic, specifically heroin and illicitly made fentanyl, not the prescription fentanyl that's prescribed for malignant pain, chronic pain, but illicitly made fentanyl, precursors and made in China and Europe and brought into the United States. So the heroin and the illicit epidemic is going up as prescribing-related morbidity and mortality is going down. And this is most evident in CDC's latest MMWR, where they actually say, for the first time since the epidemic began, that deaths from heroin now outnumber deaths from semi-synthetic opioids, and those are the hydrocodone, oxycodone, oxymorphone. And that's the first time that's happened since the beginning of the epidemic. So we see this shift of prescription-related morbidity and mortality going down, illicit-related opioid morbidity and mortality on the increase.
But can we expect that we'll see a decrease in that if, in fact, the funnel began at the doctor's office in the past? If that funnel is beginning to close down a little bit, is that a good sign?
I think it's a really good sign. My only concern is that there are people, out there with chronic pain that opioids do work for. So the fear is, when we start to, shut off the pump a little bit, how do we make it so people that use these medications that, don't have opioid use disorders can benefit from the medication? However, the train has been set in motion so that I would suggest that even though we shut off the supply of prescription opioids, which is very important because we want to stop a whole new generation of people being exposed to this, we've already unleashed the beast. And heroin and illicit fentanyl are on the rise, and we have not seen their peak yet. And what's interesting is that, CDC and the federal government and states, we can deal with the prescription opioid epidemic. We know where the prescriptions come from. We know how to shut off the pump. We know how to do education. We know how to do guidelines. We know how to deal with insurance formularies to shut off certain medications like methadone for pain. But what's a more beast is putting the heroin and the fentanyl back in the bottle, and that deal, that's international, right? That's borders, that's drug trafficking organizations. So they're going to take different and specific interventions for each one, and they're going to be different. And I would argue that the heroin and the illicit market is a more difficult beast to put back in the bottle.
Are the demographics surrounding this going to change? In other words, if it was the suburban housewife or the suburban cheerleader who got hooked because of an injury or an accident or what have you, is it now going to go more to the streets and more to poorer communities? That's where a lot of these other epidemics that we've had with drugs like crack started, and perhaps the attention that opioids is being given is because of the demographic twist that this particular epidemic has demonstrated.
No, there's no doubt that that's happening, and I think that making that claim is not cynical. And in fact, I was at the Prescription Drug Abuse and Heroin Summit 2 years ago, and President Obama spoke there, and he actually said, there's no wonder that, right now we're focusing on being smart on crime and not locking people up and not looking at addiction as a moral failure and looking at it instead as a disease with this demographic shift. Now, what's important to note is that most illicit drugs in the street markets have historically been in urban areas, open street markets. The prescription opioid epidemic, when it started in 1999, a lot of the chronic pain patients were in rural and suburban areas, right? Places with a lot of manual labor, mining, tobacco, agriculture, right? The Rust Belt, Appalachia, the Deep South, the Southwest, New Hampshire. And so you had a lot of prescribing there. And this is why the epidemic, the opioid epidemic, I would argue, and I think the literature bears this out, is that it's disproportionately in rural and suburban areas because that's where the disproportionate amount of prescribing has gone. I actually heard an interview with an African-American scholar, and he was saying that, there's a lot of literature showing that doctors were much more skeptical and hesitant to prescribe scheduled medications like opioids to African-Americans. Racial stereotypes informing their prescribing practices. They're going to sell it. They're faking their pain, and much more likely to prescribe to white folks who disproportionately live in suburban and rural areas. And I think this is why you're seeing the heroin epidemic disproportionately affecting rural and suburban areas and disproportionately affecting non-Hispanic whites specifically. However, there's one more thing I just want to point out. Theodore Cicero, his research just showed that there is an increasing trend of new heroin users who their first opioid was heroin. And so his paper really in the discussion puts forth a worry that since there's so much heroin, since people have reported to me that it's cheaper than marijuana, that it's in schools, that people are going to start transitioning to heroin as their first opioid like they did in the 70s and 80s, where they go from, a harder drug to heroin rather than through prescription opioids. So I think that is a concern, even though there's a link there and even though it's disproportionate rural and suburban. I think one concern we have is that with the onset and the increase of supply of heroin and fentanyl, are people just going to start with heroin and it's going to be its own epidemic?
And the heroin that's on the streets today, talk about it in relation to its power. And when you add fentanyl to it, I mean, that seems like just a deadly combination.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of changes in the heroin market over the last 3 or 4 years. And, DEA just came out with their heroin threat assessment, their 2015 data. And what they describe is pretty insightful. So since, the heroin supply has varied between, Southeast Asia, Southwest Asia, the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, and Colombia. And in the mid-1990s, Colombia made up the bulk of the heroin market, and this was on top of their cocaine market. However, in the last 3 years, Colombia, let me back up for a second. Colombia and Mexico really shared the heroin market in the country. West of the Mississippi River was really Mexican-sourced black tar heroin. East of the Mississippi River was Colombian, what people call brown powdered heroin. And those were the two heroin types in the country. But over the last 3 years, I think as a result of FARC making a treaty with the Colombian government and some other agricultural advancements in Colombia, the Colombians are pulling out of the heroin game. This has left a little bit of a supply drag on the East Coast heroin market. Starting in 2014, Mexico, who historically produced only a tar heroin that was a lower potency than the more purified powdered version, started producing a white powdered heroin version that was high potency. And this, over the last 2 years, has really flooded the East Coast market, so much so that DEA says that 97% of all the heroin on the East Coast is coming from Mexico, but not the tar, the powdered heroin. And it's a 70% purity coming across the border, so it's highly potent. Now, at the same time, you have fentanyl coming into the country being used to adulterate the heroin to make it both stronger and also spread out the supply. And remember, when Colombia is getting out of the game and Mexico is filling that spot, fentanyl would be a useful adulterant that would strengthen the supply of heroin and spread it out more. And so that's where you see the fentanyl coming in. DEA identifies that China has been the producer of that, and it has shifted a little bit where now they're seen as the supplier of the precursors, where the fentanyl is being made in Europe and Canada and then coming into the United States. Now, there's one more thing. So, on the one hand, we have changes in the heroin market. On the other hand, we have the introduction of illicitly made fentanyl. And the third part is internet-sourced fentanyl. And this has been a story that is just gaining some legs over the last couple months. The internet-sourced fentanyl are where most of the fentanyl analogs are coming from. The carfentanil, sufentanil, furylfentanyl, acetylfentanyl. I've met numerous people in the field, and I'm documenting this, that have ordered carfentanil online, and they sell it, and they mix it with their drugs. And so what you really have, and this is really the danger, and your listeners really need to know this, the market, contrary to the 70s and 80s and 90s, that was more standardized, right? It was drug cartel run. There was standardization of product. What we have now is an illicit opioid market that is non-standard, that is inconsistent, that is uncertain. You have heroin mixed with fentanyl. You have fentanyl alone. You have these fentanyl analogs coming from the Internet. You have many different players selling them. I've actually met a lot of users who actually people who use opioids selling stuff in order to pay for their habit And so they're in the game, drug traffickers are in the game, and so you have this heroin market where potency is all over the place and products are inconsistent. And so people that are buying these drugs off the street don't know what they're getting from one day to the next. And that's the real danger. Rather than the heroin itself, it's because, remember, back in the 90s, 80s, and 70s, we never had this many heroin overdoses. And I would argue, and again, I think the literature is bearing this out, that it's this over-determined, multi-sourced, illicitly made opioid market that's really producing the risk for overdose and other sequelae.
Dr. Jon Zibbell is with us, and of course, as you can tell, he knows so much about this opioid crisis that we're facing in America. What have we done that has been successful? I know that states like Kentucky and Ohio, they are now requiring clinicians to check the databases to see whether a patient has been receiving opioids. In the state of Connecticut, where we're emanating from, they have limited the type of prescription amounts that doctors can provide to their patients. Tell us what is going on out there that is helping at least a bit at the outset.
Yeah, there's a lot of good interventions that are out there, and we have a lot of evidence of knowing how to deal with this issue. We have 130 years of dealing with it. I would even suggest, just before I answer that, Larry, that the President's Opioid Commission, their interim report, although it was kind of sad, they've been doing this for a while, and they only have an interim report. But I read the interim report closely, and they really identify most of the evidence-based strategies that we need to get this under wraps. Now, remember I said that there was the prescription epidemic and there's the illicit epidemic.
Yes.
Those take separate interventions. So on the prescription side, we're doing a lot where, CDC has funded almost all 50 states to develop prescription drug monitoring programs, right? This allows doctors to go into a database and to see their patients and what other medications they get. So, to prevent doctor shopping or co-prescribing benzodiazepines with opioids, which we know are contraindicated for respiratory depression and overdose. And CDC also published their opioid prescribing guidelines, which is trying to give doctors a framework of really like starting low and going slow of how to prescribe. Along with, there's a lot of education in medical schools happening as well. Remember, addiction and opioid prescribing was never really taught in medical school. You learn that in situ, on the fly. And so that's happening as well. And so I think these, in toto, are really having an effect on the prescription opioid epidemic. On the illicit side, as I said, it's a little bit harder because interdiction is different than reducing prescribing. Now, on that side, we have less options on the supply side. Where we have focused historically, and I think we've seen the best bang for our buck and the best evidence, is in harm reduction interventions. In harm reduction as an alternative to abstinence-only and interdiction-only approaches recognizes that people do drugs. And if that's one constant we can say, especially as a medical anthropologist myself, one of the cultural universals of human beings is doing psychoactive substances. And we've known in the United States since the end of the 19th century that Americans do drugs and Americans love drugs. And so the harm reduction philosophy says, okay, we can't deal with interdiction. That's law enforcement. What can we do, accepting that people are going to use, to minimize the harms associated with that use? Some of the programs associated with that came out of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, specifically syringe service programs to get used contaminated syringes off the street, making sure people have supplies, not to share them. That's a big one. The other one that came out, and again, this was something done in the 80s and 90s, is the use of naloxone to reverse an overdose, the opioid overdose antidote. And this has been used, since the 70s, 80s, and throughout the 90s in order to reverse opioid overdoses. And harm reduction interventions are trying to give this drug to people who are using opioids, since they're the people at the scene of an opioid overdose, as well as first responders and law enforcement. And I would say the final thing, in this, this is a little bit contentious in a lot of areas like the Midwest or Appalachia, is the use of medicated assisted treatment modalities, and specifically buprenorphine and methadone.
Explain that to us.
Yeah, so, the logic of buprenorphine and methadone, which are both opioids, is that, someone that has an opioid use disorder and who is physically dependent on these medications and that need these medications, or so they believe, to function, instead of, and use over time changes one's brain chemistry, where you really, become physiologically, pharmacologically, hormonally dependent on these medications. When you are not on them, you have cravings and you relapse and you overdose and you start injecting again. Instead, putting people on opioid medications, specifically opioid medications that are less psychoactive. So methadone, we've been studying methadone for 40 years. It's one of the best medications we have. Methadone allows people to go to a clinic and take a medication that acts like heroin on their brain but doesn't produce all those psychoactive effects. It minimizes cravings. It makes it so you don't go into withdrawal. And so, again, people can get their medication but also have productive lives so they don't have to chase their drugs. I would make the analogy to someone who's on chronic pain medication that repetitively takes opioids. If they start taking them, they will go into physical withdrawal, but they have their supply in their chronic condition or their disease is taken care of. The same logic applies to these medications. It's the logic of that opioid use disorder is a disease. It's social, but it's also a brain disease, and it's hormonal, and it's related to your central nervous system. And so medications that engage those receptors in that central nervous system to give you the feelings of comfort that you can't get from regular life are a benefit and will get people off of street drugs. We have 40 years of evidence of methadone and a little less evidence of buprenorphine as medications that can actually treat opioid use disorder. And so those are amazing medications. Now, unfortunately, I've spent a lot of time in Kentucky and West Virginia, and those places, have so much PTSD, I would argue, from the pill epidemic and pill mills, that they really have a hard time seeing the benefits of giving someone an opioid with an opioid use disorder. It goes kind of counter to their moral universe. It's kind of like saying, someone is shooting drugs, give them clean syringes, it's going to keep them safe, right? It seems counterintuitive. But when you get into the science, very effective for reducing the harms associated with addiction and also the diseases and sequelae associated with drug addiction and injecting drug use.
Well, Dr. Jon Zibbell, you have given us so much to think about today on our America Trends podcast, and we thank you so much. And unfortunately, I think the need to have you back again will be apparent over the coming period so we can track where this epidemic is, and we will feel free to call upon you. And you've been remarkable today. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, and thanks for all the work you do. It's a pleasure.
The opioid crisis here in the United States, it is something that is afflicting, of course, every community. And, John, I think we got a greater sense of some of the origins of this problem and the two different problems that we have, legal and illegal. And I thought that Dr. Zibbell did a great job. He really did.
Well, it's just shocking. I mean, we've talked about this many times on the radio, and we got to get a grips on this because it's crazy. It's, people are dying and it's bad.
There are so many facets to it, and I've been reading stories because I'm moderating a panel on opioids here in our state, and I'm just learning so many things. I mean, there's some concern that actually some of the Medicaid expansion has been getting more pain-killing medication to people, but that is causing this unintended consequence. There's talk about what we're doing with our veterans, many of whom have been using this because of PTSD. So it has so many implications for our society. And, during that interview, we did mention, and it was quoted about a gentleman by the name of Sam Quinones, who has done some of the most groundbreaking work on this topic in all of America.
Yeah, we talked to him, I think 2 or 3 times on the radio, and each time it's just it's an incredible lesson on what's going on out there in the world. I mean, it's something.
Well, and his book, Dreamland, talking about some of the things that really started this in terms of the use of these opiates and heroin and its availability and its power and potency in our society today. And again, we talked about heroin being one of those things that was so taboo to most middle-class Americans in the past. It was just something that you looked upon with horror, and yet now it is part of this scourge that we're talking about. We should go back and listen to the interview that we did with Sam Quinones, who really helps to frame this issue.
Let's do that.
All right, let's do that right now. Okay, there was something that was supposed to play to help us get started today on Talk of the Town, but it is not cooperating. But I'm sure the equipment will kind of warm up to the entire exercise as we go along. 9 minutes after 10 o'clock, I'm Larry Rifkin, and I want to talk to you about an issue and bring forward someone who can really give us some important information. If there is one issue that, affects us in urban areas, rural areas, has a political impact, and most importantly, has impact on the lives, the health, the safety of Americans today. It is heroin and the addiction that comes from so many individuals, starting off with painkillers and then needing and wanting to go on to something else. And that's something else that has been made available in this country cheaply and really just powerfully and potently is heroin. And it's a problem everywhere. And in fact, I'm reading that it's having a tremendous impact on a lot of the races that are going on for the U.S. Senate. That those candidates who were not doing terribly well, many of the Republican incumbents, and they want to hold on to the Senate, who are dealing aggressively with the issue of opiates and heroin, are actually doing well. Because that is of such great importance to people all across the country. And you look at Connecticut, here's a headline from the News-Times in Danbury, Connecticut's worst opiate epidemic. Have we seen the worst? And now we've got just the susceptibility of many of our first responders. We had SWAT officers yesterday in Hartford who were exposed to heroin and fentanyl during a drug raid. It was airborne, and they had to be taken to the hospital. And then there are other first responders here in the state of Connecticut who are raising concerns about Narcan, which is what they inject to save somebody who is, in fact, overdosing. And they're saying, certain of the police unions, why am I doing this? This isn't really my job, and I don't want to have that responsibility. So it is a problem no matter which way you look at it. Well, there's a gentleman who's really looked at it so seriously and given us the long view. His name is Sam Quinones. And Sam, you were with us, about a year ago, talking about Dreamland. Sam?
That's correct. Yes, I was.
Okay. And the book, The True Tale of America's Opiate Addiction and Epidemic. Tell me, how much has changed over even the last year?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Since Dreamland came out, I guess what a few things have changed that are important to note. One is that, and probably the most important, is that this is now recognized as a major issue. I could tell you when I was writing Dreamland, I felt very alone. And that's to say, I could speak with, I spoke with lots of people who were right on top of this issue, cops, coroners, jailers, public health nurses. But there was a big gaping hole in America back then where it was not being discussed. Parents especially were not talking about it publicly. They were ashamed. They were mortified that their kids were addicted or the kids had died. So they were the main thing, that they were not bringing this out. And when they didn't bring it out, then, of course, politicians really didn't recognize it as an urgent issue either. And so they weren't talking about it. So you had a real enormous silence. And really, in my opinion, I thought that's why this has spread so completely across the country, is because for so many years, for years now, this is not a new thing. This has been percolating for 10, 15 years now. This was allowed to spread because people were ashamed and they thought they were alone. They thought they were like the only one in a 5 or 10 mile radius that had this problem, when it turns out that actually many people in so many towns across the country were were facing this. I would say also, though, that what has also happened in the last couple of years has been an enormous expansion of the heroin market. Mm-hmm. It was growing. It was this kind of transition, as you mentioned in the intro, from opiate painkillers, legitimate medicine abused and people getting addicted to those pills, Vicodin, Percocet, OxyContin. That's been going on for a long time. The transition to heroin has been going on for a long time, but what has really accelerated is that transition. So now you're seeing more and more people, and of course in the underworld, people have recognized this as a burgeoning new drug market, and they have shifted their offerings, and so we are now getting even more very cheap heroin from Mexico. Basically, all our heroin now is coming from Mexico or Colombia, but if it comes from Colombia, it usually is coming through Mexico too. So and so what that has done has swamped the market with very cheap stuff and very potent stuff, as you said, and that means that now when an addict gets out of say rehabilitation or jail, one of the two, he or she comes back to a community that is now really awash in these drugs that's very easy to find and very dangerous. So now rehab is almost like Russian roulette, because when you get out of rehab, so many people relapse. It's a very, very common thing in addiction treatment that people will relapse. It's not the first time, doesn't always take. In fact, sometimes it takes half a dozen or more times to do it. And so when you relapse in those conditions, you are very likely, it's very easy to kill yourself. You go back and you start using, sometimes it's the same dosage as before, and your body's not used to it after 6 months clean, and you die. When you relapse off of alcoholism, if you're alcoholic and you stop drinking and you relapse, it doesn't kill you. It's not good, but it doesn't kill you.
Yeah, we saw where Chevy Chase is going back in for kind of a freshening up of his concerns about alcohol. But in this case, with heroin, first of all, did we want to hide this because there was, basically this movement in the medical industry to make certain that, they relieve pain and suffering. And then all of these new miracle drugs that came along, particularly OxyContin. I mean, explain to us what the role might have been in terms of those trying to do well by us and what happened in this circumstance.
Right, exactly. Well, there was a revolution really in pain management that began, I would say, in the late 80s, but really grew energetic, I would say, in the mid-1990s, that held that we were a country in pain, an epidemic of pain, and we were not treating it because doctors were terrified of using these narcotic pain pills, and we needed to make far more aggressive use of these narcotic pain pills, the kinds that I mentioned, to treat pain. And at first it was terminal cancer patients, their pain. But then very quickly it grew beyond that to all kinds of pain because doctors bought the idea that was then floated and pushed very aggressively by first pain specialists and then also pain pharmaceutical companies, that these pills could be prescribed without risk of addicting the patient. So virtually non-addictive is what these pills were sold as for the pain patient, for a person being treated with pain. And doctors all across the country bought that idea and continue to buy that idea in some areas, a lot of areas. And what that meant was, first of all, that you could use these pills for all manner of pain, for post-wisdom tooth extraction, for back pain, for an appendix operation, and that's something else that was very important. What it meant was it didn't matter what the dosage was, because if they're virtually non-addictive, what did it matter if you prescribed 3 or 60? And what ended up happening was doctors all across the country routinely began to prescribe in huge amounts. Not just prescribe these pills, but prescribe them in huge amounts. That created an enormous new supply and a sustained supply for 20 years. And a lot of that leaked out into the black market. A lot of that actually did addict the people who used them according to doctors' advice. And we have now two very important ways through which people get addicted. One is simply being prescribed the pills. And, of course, the other is that there's so many of them out there in the black market that people then got addicted. And then, of course, those pills contain drugs that are chemically very similar, cousins basically, to heroin. And so when you're addicted to those drugs, and the price of them rises, either you can't find them anymore, or the doctor won't prescribe anymore, or a variety of things could happen, you then very quickly people tend to make that transition to heroin if they don't care.
And then, of course...
So that's kind of what's gotten us where we are.
Okay, and of course, there were people who saw what was going on in America. I mean, that there was this overprescribing. And you say it wasn't even the drug cartels necessarily, but some very ambitious, working-class young men from a small town in Mexico, independent of the cartels, who went in search of, well, you called it their own American dream.
Right, exactly. There was the first... Nowadays, we're seeing that all Mexican trafficking groups have figured out the heroin market in America. I mean, that's not a news anymore. But years ago, the first one to figure out, the first group to figure out if that pills would lead to, this massive prescribing of pills would lead to a large increase in heroin in the heroin market, was a group of guys from a small town called Jalisco in the state of Nayarit. And they discovered this when they were in, one of them, in fact, one guy in particular, who I interviewed and put in the book, figured this out when he got to Columbus, Ohio, which at the time was kind of the center for the pill promotion. And the pain revolution, that's one of the main places it was being promoted and aggressively marketed to. He figured out, there's a lot of people here who are switching to heroin. If I stick with this, I'm going to have a huge market. And it was the guys from Jalisco, Nayarit, who had developed a system for selling heroin very much like pizza, like delivery. I will deliver your heroin to you wherever you are. And they had taken that system and expanded throughout the western United States. And in the late 1990s, 98, summer of 98 to be exact, they made that jump over the Mississippi. Primarily to Columbus.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we lost you there for a moment. But go on. So they made the leap over to Columbus.
Right, and they came just at the moment when these pills were being prescribed massively, and they in fact found a greater market there than they'd ever expected in the West Coast, where in the western side of the United States, where they had been using their franchise system. That was still a time when mid-90s, that was still a time when the pills were not very widely used. And the addicts in each town where they were, Salt Lake, Reno, Portland, Albuquerque, Phoenix, these were towns that really had very static numbers of addicts. The market was static. It wasn't growing. They come to Columbus and they find, whoa, the market all of a sudden is growing, and they stick with it. They are the first heroin traffickers. Not the only heroin traffickers in America, of course, but they're from Mexico. But they're the first heroin traffickers from Mexico to figure out and then systematically exploit the new heroin market that this increase in pill prescribing implies. And they do it in Columbus, and then they begin to look for other markets, of course, Nashville, Charlotte,
and then they find their
Cincinnati.
way into a lot of rural communities. I mean, New Hampshire, during that primary debate, I remember Chris Christie, who was talking about what was going on in New Jersey and really relating to the problem, which is really significant in New Hampshire. And I understand that Kelly Ayotte, who's running for the Senate again, is really pouncing on this issue and starting to win back a lot of the people who were concerned about her, as an incumbent, because she has focused so much on this issue. So this is now a big political issue.
It absolutely is, but that's because the pill prescribing was particularly intense in white communities. It's almost entirely white communities, that, by the way, that are affected by this, and in suburban, rural, small-town areas of the United States. And it's also true, the problem is there also because people were not prepared for it. They'd never seen this before. Their response was to go inside, to silence themselves, to say, oh, my God, my son's addicted. I don't dare tell anybody. And where do I go to get him treatment? No idea. There isn't anything around here, in fact. So the problem became especially acute because the prescribing was heavy there, and those communities were completely unprepared, unarmed, you might say, in how to deal with this new thing because they'd never seen it before. Also, I have to say, a lot of those small town, small county coroners had never really dealt with large numbers of addiction, of overdoses. They didn't know how to process it. Frequently, they get pressure from families who they know because it's a small county. Hey, don't you dare put that my son died of a heroin overdose. So it's also hidden in that way. That's another way it got hidden in a lot of these smaller areas, and that's why rural areas seem to be, and small, I would say suburban, rural, heartland, small town areas seem to be the hardest hit because they were the least prepared for it, and the reaction was to silence it, to not put that information in the coroner's report or in the obituary, and to not tell your friends that you sent your son to a rehab clinic for 6 months somewhere out of state. All of that plays a big role in why this spread so badly to those areas.
Okay, Dreamland is the book, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic. Sam Quinones, nobody understands this story better than he. And there is that picture on your cover of small-town America. Now, here in Connecticut, we're giving ourselves some pat on the back, saying that we're really limiting the prescriptions that doctors can provide to a 7-day unless you can show that there's a need to exempt, your patient from this. I'm reading where other states are fighting this opioid epidemic with a lot of data, and they're looking in at the prescribing tendencies of various doctors. And then, of course, the other piece is the Narcan piece, where we're asking a lot of first responders, police, and others to help people at their stage that is most critical and to give these injections. Are those being developed and simulated around the country, these kinds of responses?
Yes, sure. One problem that America faces is that for so long, for example, I had my appendix out. This was about 6-8 years ago. For acute pain, post-operative pain, which lasts about 3 days, you only need 3 or 4 or 5 days worth of pills, no more than that. I got 60 Vicodin. That was routine. That's what led to this. So the more doctors can recognize this, and instead of giving 60, they give 8 or 10. That multiplied by millions of doctors will have an enormous effect on stopping the creation of addicts in the first place. The problem with, as you mentioned, Narcan, yes, is being widely adopted across the country, and the problem is, I understood your police union a little bit because they are saying, why are we doing this? First of all, that's not our job. But second of all, it enables people to keep using because they've survived. They don't face the consequences of their overdosing. The problem that we face is that we do not have any good options right now with regard to this. I understand some of the frustration of police, even paramedics sometimes, who may give Narcan to the same addict 2 or 3 times on the same night. The guy will go right back out, use again, and OD again, and the paramedics will Narcan him one more time. The problem is we don't have any good options here. You either use it and save a life, and then there are consequences, or the person dies. And the idea is really that you have to allow the person time to want to find recovery, to seek recovery, and you cannot recover if you are dead. And this is the basic problem that we face. And so, police and paramedics and sometimes teachers and public health folks, all that kind of stuff, they're all getting trained in Narcan. I know many departments of it have used it, and many people have been saved because of it. I would share the frustration of a lot of people in law enforcement and elsewhere say, these guys go right back out and use again. That's the slavery, though. That shows you the slavery that opiate addiction submits.
Well, let me ask you, when does opiate addiction and heroin addiction not have a causal, relationship. In other words, with all of the cheap heroin now cut with this fentanyl, which evidently is so powerful that there are going to be addicts who want this. Forget the origin of the painkiller, and
because nobody really that I know of, and there are very few cases. The rule is people do not set out one day to say, I want to be a heroin addict. That does not happen. What happens is you need that gateway, and the pills are the gateway because, first of all, they're plentiful, but also they don't seem harmful because they're prescribed by a doctor, because they have pharmaceutical stampings on them, because it doesn't have that, and also you don't start out shooting it up. You start out popping a pill, and then with the case of OxyContin, you lick the time-release coating off, and you have a full block of dope right there. You snort it, and then your tolerance rises, and you smoke it, and then you're using more and more, and then eventually it takes months, although it's not that long, it takes a while, and then eventually you're shooting it up. And once you do that, then of course you're shooting up a lot of it. The cost is a big factor at that point. You're strung out. You're using 200-300 milligrams a day. In many communities, that's going to be $200 and $300 a day. You can't continue that, and so eventually you make the transition to heroin. But very few people that I've encountered started out thinking they would ever use.
Well, I was just wondering what happens to this market. Yeah, I was just wondering, with all the pipeline that has been set up for this and the marketing of this by these cartels and others, what they're going to do, because this is going to begin to dry up, I would imagine. It might well, except for that we seem not to be creating new pill addicts all the time. That's the problem. When you're in a hole, you got to stop digging. Seems to me like we need to stop. One of the things we need to stop doing is digging anymore, and by that I mean we need to really curtail. And I don't mean just blanket stop prescribing. There are people who need these pills. But we don't need to prescribe as aggressively as we have. And what's also the case is for a long time, people with chronic pain who have needed these pills have also been prescribed only these pills for their pain. And my feeling is that talking to a lot of people, I'm no doctor, but my impression is that more and more in medicine, people are coming to the idea that these pills are part, but only a small part, of a multidisciplinary approach to treating chronic pain that is really the most effective and least risky. And so overall, we need to cut back. I do not believe that we need to stop. These are valid tools in medicine. They are used very effectively for acute pain. There are some other uses for them, and of course, terminal cancer patients, I believe, it's very valid use to use them with people who are spending in the last 3 or 4 months of life and just assuage their pain. But it's the over prescribing, the massive prescribing, the kind of unthinking prescribing of bottles of 60 Vicodin, no matter what the pain you're dealing with. That's what's got us to where we are. And yes, my feeling is that the fentanyl and carfentanil, which is an elephant painkiller, is being used. I would doubt it's being used by the guys that I wrote about, because they view a living addict as an ATM machine. They want to keep that alive as long as possible. They don't want that to die. But I think there's a lot of people now involved in this market. The guys that I wrote about were, could call them maybe the pioneers, I suppose, but they were certainly guys who first recognized this, but now everybody recognizes it, and there's a lot of unsavory folks out there. This is the heroin market, after all. It's an unregulated thing. And so, use something that'll make you, a $5,000% markup in profit. Well, I'll use that, sure. And who cares if people die? Okay, let me take a call, and then we'll ask another question and run, but a fascinating conversation. Sam Quinones, the book is called Dreamland. Cliff is on the line for you. Hi, Cliff.
Hey, Sam. Thanks for taking my call. Thanks, Larry. What I see is that in the African-American community, I don't know if you covered this, in the black community, it seems that this issue would be a criminal element. So in other words, the victims and the suspects would be criminalized. whereas now I see in an urban area it's a health issue. And so the whites need treatment, opposed to in the black community that they're criminals. And so there's a less of an emphasis on treatment. However, there's more of an emphasis on the criminal side, opposed to what I've seen in white American and the suburban areas. Let's get treatment. Let's get help. Now, am I wrong in that analysis?
No, you're not. And that's exactly kind of if you compare the two drug scourges, I think if you compare crack of the mid-'80s, late '80s, early '90s, and this heroin thing today, we have a completely different response to both of those.
Thank you.
One was jail and prison, and the other was, hey, you know what? This is a disease. We need to treat it as such. We need to provide treatment. We cannot provide the one-size-fits-all approach of throwing everybody, throwing them in prison, throwing away the key, that kind of thing. There are a few reasons for that. One is I do believe it's a kind of a racial idea that white America is now figuring out that their kids get addicted too. And their response is understanding the onerous burden that a felony record places on you for the rest of your life. They have decided, no, we can't have this. We need treatment. They were the ones, I would say, by and large, who voted for and supported politicians who voted for a one size fits all approach back in the crack days, which was prison and jail. And so yes, that is what's happening. They've had their consciousness raised because they know people, they know kids, the pastor's son, the quarterback on the football team, even the doctor's son down the street. They're all getting addicted. And I know these kids are good kids. They're not criminals. And so we need a new approach, and we need to promote the idea that we cannot arrest our way out of this. It's almost a cliche now. However, one other thing, though, bears mentioning in this, and that is that I was a reporter in a crime reporter during the crack years in California, and the thing about the crack epidemic was that it was accompanied by an enormous amount of public violence, drive-by shootings, carjackings, gangs selling dope. It besieged neighborhoods, and it was truthfully in the town I was in, the black community calling for police action. No one was calling for treatment for anybody back then that I remember. It was a very, very serious thing. Bullets whizzing through houses, a very public kind of violence. The murder rate went way high, records every year. A lot of other things, blight and graffiti and crack houses accompanied this as well. It was a public blight. It was a scourge of public violence. The heroin epidemic, the opiate pill heroin epidemic, is quite the opposite. It's very quiet. There is no crime associated with it. Very little, I should say, certainly very little public crime of public murders or shootings or gang trafficking or anything like that. This is all quiet. And if it were accompanied, I believe, by the same kind of public violence that accompanied the crack epidemic, I suspect you would not be hearing the same calls for treatment. That it would be, hey, get these people off the street. The most immediate problem is the public violence. But certainly there is a strong difference between the approach to crack and the approach to this opiate pill heroin.
I'll tell you what, Sam, you've given us so much of your knowledge today, but I'm going to ask you for one more thing because I think it would be an injustice for me. And I wanted to do this earlier, but maybe my timing, while it was not good at that time, is exquisite now. I would like John, my producer, to get back to you and see if I can get you back on before the election, because this whole issue, Sam has been called by the San Francisco Chronicle, the book review, the most original writer on Mexico and the border. And I owe it to my audience to have somebody who understands what's going on the border, to answer questions that they might have about walls, about immigration. So can I get you back before November?
Happy to do it. I'm pretty busy traveling around the country speaking about Dreamland, but I'm happy to be on your show. No problem.
Okay, we will get back to you later today and try to set that up, okay?
That sounds good to me.
Thank you very much, Sam. A remarkable presentation this morning. If you like this episode, please leave us a kind rating or review. I'm on my hands and knees. Please do it on iTunes, because your review is really critical for us to continue providing this podcast. And John, I know that iTunes looks at this. They want to make certain that we have some ranking, some visibility, and that we're getting some traffic, and then they give you better positioning.
Absolutely. And this way, it'll put us in the forefront so you can find us much easier on your iPhone or Android, whatever you may be using.
And they may even send you out an alert. So please, if you can, don't miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. And, John, they can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com.
And also subscribe on our website.
Oh, absolutely.
We send out a little blurb, and we can also take your emails there at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. That's another way to get us.
And we do not sell or share
no
our list.
spamming, nothing.
Well, I don't know. Does anybody want our list? I don't know, but we don't do it.
Good question.
Even if they asked us.
Even
Nobody's
if they
asked
asked
us.
us.
But
Right.
And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. We're getting very active on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms, and John, this is really easy, @Trends Podcast. That's it.
That's real easy.
You like that? Did you get that?
I got that.
Okay.
I'm going to have to
gonna
check
give you
it
a
out
quiz.
now. I'm going to have to twit it.
We want to thank you, of course, personally for subscribing. And we also would like to get some of your ideas and questions for future episodes of America Trends Podcast. And that's important, too, because we're all over the map. Our interest editorially in the future, John, has no bounds. But we want to know what it is that you'd like to hear from us. If there was a segment that you'd like to see us follow up on, or if there's something in depth that you'd like us to deal with, please let us know that, too.
We're looking at the future. There's so much we can look at.
Yeah, and the topics that we've dealt with, I mean, we have gotten such incredible guests over the recent period, but they're only going to come to us if they know we've got an engaged and interactive audience.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that you become part of this podcast in so many different ways that we're sharing with you today.
You're absolutely right. We need your support and your help and your reviews.
And your ideas.
And ideas.
Or questions on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us @Trends Podcast or using the hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have a public one that you'd like us to give out.
Yeah, good. Hey, and you know what? We didn't mention Amazon.
Oh, yes. We have an Amazon store.
Yes.
And so if you go up, you don't have to buy the things that might be highlighted at that particular time. You can buy any book, and there's some benefit that comes back
Just
to
put
us.
what you're looking at in the little search engine block there, and it'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll help us out.
Absolutely. And it doesn't really cost you anything more because they have built that into their pricing structure. So we get a little taste and you get more programming like this and you get the item that you were looking for. So it works for all of us.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Win-win-win.
So for more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. And again, you can find John and I here in our studio performing as best we can for you.
That's right.
And
Let us
making
out.
certain- What's that? Let us let us out. No one is. Hey, listen, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends. We'll see you next time.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Oh, by the way, we are posting all the time. And we're posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Good point.
So just be aware, if you're looking for new episodes, they're coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When you wake up, before you go out on your jog or your walk and you want to take us with you, we'll be there for you.
Very good.
All right. Have a great day.